Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted to be here tonight with all of you, wherever you are watching from, and especially to be here with Dr. Christia Spears Brown, who is a professor of developmental psychology and the director of the Center for Equality and Social Justice at the University of Kentucky. Her research focuses on children's experiences with ethnic, racial, and gender discrimination and stereotypes, and how racism and sexism impacts the academic, social, and psychological lives of children and teens. In addition to her award-winning scientific research, articles, chapters, and academic books, and numerous teaching awards, she is the author of Parenting Beyond Pink and Blue: How to Raise Children Free of Gender Stereotypes, which has been a Charis, beloved Charis title for many years, I'm happy to say. So when we saw that you had written a new book, we jumped right on it, and we're really excited to get to talk to you, Dr. Brown. And I am here as in my role, both as a bookseller, but also because I co-facilitate three groups at Charis. One, the Race Conscious Parenting Collective, which is a collective for white parents of white or multiracial, biracial children or adopted children of color who are seeking to undo white supremacy from within the family. So really focusing on the earliest age at which we can intervene in some of these biases that you're going over in your book. And also our Gender Creative Parenting Collective, which is a group for mostly cisgender and usually straight parents of gender creative, gender expansive, possibly trans kids who are, the parents are trying to figure out, how do I make the world a bigger place than what I was raised in? And then finally, we have two groups that are support groups one is for trans youth and one is for trans adults, people who are coming out later in life as trans. So I am very honored to be a part of all of those. And I was very excited to read your book and see that we're on the right track with the advice that we give. So I'm hoping maybe you can start us out here a little bit with the frame. So you focus on sort of three main areas, but can you just tell us a little bit about how you chose the frame for the book and how you came to write it?
Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, I do research on how kids experience discrimination and how they form stereotypes. But over time, I got, so I also write for parents and kind of talk increasingly to parents and schools and things like that. And increasingly, I've been really bothered by all the things that I think parents and schools might try to do for individual kids, but you realize there's all these structural biases in place too. And that, we can kind of change the hearts and minds all we want, but if the laws are still biased and the policies are still biased, then that doesn't really get us very far, right? The trans athletes, in high school is a perfect example. If kids are still excluded from participating in a sport or going to the restroom that they identify with, then all the hearts and minds aren't going to do a whole lot of good, right? So that led me to thinking about doing this book in terms of thinking, if we want to kind of get rid of biases, we got to pay attention to both of those threads. So I think the hearts and minds part, but also the kind of brick and mortar part of it. So what are our schools like? What are our laws like? Because I think we got to deal both. I mean, part of the idea is that when you have biased laws and policies, so for example, different funding levels to, schools that have predominantly white kids versus kids that are Black and brown, which is what we have in the US, that leads to inequalities, right? So the kids that go to the more affluent schools do better because the schools have way more resources than the others. Well, then that just goes and reinforces the stereotypes we had already. So it's this feedback loop of structural biases lead to inequalities, and then that keeps those stereotypes and prejudices we have entrenched. So that was the kind of idea of the book so the first part of it sets up what are our laws and how are they biased towards kids. So really kind of focusing on kids, particularly in schools. So talking about race. So some of the earliest laws where we know about segregation, things like that. Thinking about immigration, some of the laws that say you have to have certain kind of documentation to go to a public school. We know that that's leaves a lot of kids out. And so how those laws changed, looking at gender, particularly sexual harassment, and then looking at particularly trans and gay and lesbian youth, kind of the bullying and the harassment that goes on at schools, and looking at how have those laws really changed and how have we gotten better. So partly it is in some ways depressing because you see how bad things have been, but then you also see moments of real progress. So that's the first part of it, is those kind of structures and laws and the history of how we got to where we are now. The second part of it is just the psychology of it. So how does it affect people in their real lives? So what's it like for the kid that's getting bullied in school? How often does that happen? What's some of the media impacts? So again, across those different social groups, what leads kids to be discriminated against? And then on the flip side, what leads kids to hold stereotypes and biases about others? Because we know that those start really early. And then the third part's meant to be a little bit more of the optimistic, kind of where do we go from here? Like, what do we do? And so that really talks to parents and teachers. So like, what can you do at home that's really based in the science? So for all the studies that have been done, what do we know seems to work, and pulling from all sorts of different places? What can we do in our schools and communities? And then what can we do more writ large in society? So things like voting, paying attention to who's running for the school board, the kind of bigger things in terms of media. And so that was kind of trying to end on a more positive note. So that's really the frame. And the idea is that everybody needs to be a little bit more pissed off, but also feel empowered to, I think a little fire in the belly is a good thing, but then also know where to direct that, right? So to feel passionate about it and to know where the problems are, and then to know, well, what can I do about that? And to care not just about your own kid, but all the other kids that are different than yours too. And even if you don't have kids, you should care about the kids in the community. And so what can those folks do?
Yeah, I think that's a thing one of the things that I've been very grateful for during the pandemic, but really, for the last, 15 years or so, is that a lot of my hope comes from working with parents, because I feel like, all right, y'all are really trying something different with your kids. Yeah. And that feels exciting to me. And it does feel like the place where we can have the most impact on culture is by, raising children differently and changing the norms in schools so that children, figure out that, calling somebody gay is not a slur, right? And all those kinds of things that many other folks took for granted as just inevitable, or the boys will be boys and girls will be girls kind of language that so many of us grew up with. I think we actually really do have a chance to intervene. Right. One of the things that we often hear, even from parents who are kind of on board with the idea of raising anti-racist children, or children who show less bias, is well, I can't start doing that from birth, right? Like, that's always the question. And it's like, well, families of color talk about race with their children from birth, so white people can too. We know that, right? But in your book, you also provide a lot of really useful data, I think, to folks to say, like, no, children do recognize difference from a very early age. So could you talk a little bit about that research?
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely have the same experience as you do. Like, that's often the biggest point of, well, they're too young. And then I think it's also really I think there's a well-intentioned part of that. The idea that if I point it out, then they'll start paying attention to race, and then it'll make it worse. So I think it's well-intentioned parents often who think, I don't want to point it out early because then it will make my child racially biased. The reality is that there's a lot of research that's been done with infants that shows kids are paying attention to race. The idea is that, well, kids are colorblind. I always say, no, that's like a medical condition. Like, if we see color, we come in different shades. And if you take away the social taboos of talking about it, of course we come in different shades. Like, I can look and see, you have no hair on top, I have hair on top. Like, those are physical differences that I can say out loud. because we don't have all this like cultural baggage that goes along with whether you have hair or not hair, right?
Yeah.
And so kids notice those, like, of course they do. And so I think adults, particularly white adults, think, oh, they notice it and they put all of the other history and all of the other stuff on it. It's like, no, kids just see that we look different. They can categorize. They do studies with infants where infants like look at pictures and they can tell by looking at, there's lots of methods for how they do studies with infants. So before they can talk about looking at their looking time and all sorts of details that I would teach in an infant cognition class, but I won't bore you with. But it shows that they can categorize by racial groups. They could, Black African-American folks in one category, Asian category fits, white category fits, in the same way they do for gender too. They do for men and for women, particularly if their hair looks different and they have things like makeup and earrings. And so, of course, babies know that. And what we also see is by the time they're about 2 and 3, they start recognizing stereotypes and status differences. By the time kids are 5, they're endorsing much bigger stereotypes. And so what we know is that kids are paying attention to differences really early. When it comes to race, they learn by about the time they're 6 or 7 to stop talking about race, that it's taboo. But at the same time, their stereotypes keep increasing. And since white adults don't ever talk about it, kids come up with their own stories about why the world looks the way it does. And so these stereotypes grow in the absence of adult input. And so that's what's really problematic, is that by adults not talking about it, by parents not talking about it. And again, this really references white parents. Kids are developing really strong stereotypes because media is really biased. We see in studies that kids as young as 5 and 6 say when they see a person like a Middle Eastern Muslim person, they'll say he's more likely to be like a terrorist or violent or angry. And I'm like, I'm sure no one explicitly told a 6-year-old child that. Not in the central part of the United States. It probably just doesn't come up. But kids have seen enough biased media images in their 5 or 6 years of life that they, even if they don't know what the words mean or anything about it, they'll endorse those stereotypes. So there's all this stuff that's growing in the background. But in the absence of talking about it, kids just form these biases. So I think, oftentimes when parents say, oh, my kid doesn't notice that, he would never say that. I was like, you just never ask them. Because as a developmental psychologist that goes to schools and asks kids about their biases, parents would be horrified by what their kids say. And I mean, my own child as well. And so I think that that's just part of development. And if we're not really, really kind of talking about it and being the louder voice in their ear, then the rest of the biased, kind of media landscape is the only thing talking. And I do think parents of color have these same conversations. And I think, you see this a lot, but if a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old, Black kid can experience discrimination, then a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old white kid can have a conversation about discrimination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We often joke about the sort of grocery store moment when a child will point at somebody and name a difference, and the parent freaks out and is like, unsure what to do. But I think one of the things, and I don't know if this is something that has been studied a lot, but it also seems like that creates a cognitive dissonance in children when they are like, I am commenting on observable things in reality and you're telling me they don't exist, right? That is crazy making. And I certainly believe that is a lot of the reason why white people are more violent and, do a lot of really awful things, is because many of us have been told that our perception of reality is not real.
Right. As opposed to, and I think it's because it's embarrassing for white families. We want to pretend that race doesn't exist. And so because we're uncomfortable with racism. And so there's a real difference between talking about race and talking about racism as a thing to fight, as opposed to endorsing ideas of racism. And so white parents have to be really clear on those differences and be mindful of, I talk quite a bit in the book about raising kind of anti-racist kids. And we do a lot of work on that. And the idea that in the in the absence, there's no way to raise anti-racist kids in the absence of conversations about race and racism, because they won't have the vocabulary to explain how we all look different and why do we look different and why do they see the differences they see. This is really true for all kids. I mean, we did one study where we were showing kids pictures of the presidents of the United States. So this was right before Barack Obama was elected. So not that long ago, but it was before we had a Black president. Definitely before we've had a female president, because that's still to the day. And kids were asked in elementary school, why has there never been Black president? You know, is worded more kid friendly than that. 1/3 of Black kids thought it was against the law in like 2004 for there to be a Black president. 1/3 of girls thought it was against the law for a woman to be president. Clearly, no one ever told them that. But in the absence of talking about, why do you think all the presidents have been mostly white? With the exception of one who is biracial, why have none of them been women? We don't have those conversations. So kids come up with their own explanations, which are, a lot of people say, because girls can't be good presidents, because they wouldn't make good leaders, because they're trying to come up with an answer that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And if they don't have a more complex understanding of bias, their answers are pretty stereotypical, because that at least logically makes sense. Like there must be a reason, right? Right. So it must be that they're not good, or there's a law banning it.
Yeah. I mean, that's so, and to sort of pivot to some of the research on sex and gender, it also seems like there's a corollary there, with kids. So much of, parents are like, well, I'm just raising my child to be a normal boy or a normal girl. Like, and if they just watch their father and me, like they'll see that, like, this is just how you're supposed to be a man or you're supposed to be a woman, and it'll all be fine. Right. And usually that means also like they will be straight and they will get married and not have children out of wedlock or do any of these other, that implies a whole bunch of stuff. Right. But it starts at a very, it starts from birth, the way that we gender children and put all this kind of stuff on them. And obviously children, I mean, one of my experiences of being a trans person is like the ways that kids read your gender is often much more authentic than the way that adults read your gender, because they actually are picking up on what you're putting out into the world, as opposed to what adults think they're supposed to say, or, so there's some interesting, I've always been sort of fascinated by very young kids' perception of gender. But can you talk a little bit about the toy studies that you did and some of the other ways that y'all have studied gender with young kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it is an interesting idea where kids are, I think you have two things going on at the same time. One is that kids, well, first of all, kids are not very, and I went into a lot of this in the first book, the parenting kind of Beyond Pink and Blue book, but kids by gender, if you look at just kind of how they are identified at birth, boys and girls, remarkably similar, not very many group level differences. So first of all, like the first thing that always has to be said is boys and girls don't actually differ in really any systematic ways. Individual differences between individual kids, much bigger than group level differences. That said, when you look at what they're playing with, it looks completely different oftentimes. But it's because kids are really responding to things like marketing cues. So they've done all these studies where you make up a toy that a kid's never seen and you put it in a pink box. And the girls say it's interesting. They want to play with it. They'll spend all this time with it. Boys will say, no, it's boring. I don't want to touch it. You put the exact same toy in a blue box, give it to another group of kids. The boys will be like, oh, this is interesting. It's so fascinating. They'll spend all this time playing with it. The girls won't want to touch it at all. So it's like, it's not about the toy. It's about doing what they think they're supposed to for their group, because everybody kind of wants to fit in and be like a good group member. And if you make the team girl and boy really, really important, like we do often in society, where we say, good morning, boys and girls, let's line up, boy, girl, boy, girl. Okay, what a pretty girl you are. What a smart boy you are. We make it so important. So kids are like latching on to what kind of information they can find about it. And we color code the heck out of everything. So kids are drawn to that, and it has nothing to do with innate interest in trucks. Like people are like, well, boys are just innately interested in trucks. I was like, there's nothing on our DNA that codes for wheels and plastic components. Like evolution doesn't work that way, right?
They didn't know about that when they were.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing about, remote controls that's genetically coded. And so it's so social. So you have kids that are really rigid in that way, but at the same time, your point about how do kids look at gender, kids are also really open to, if you present a different world to them and present gender as just like a spectrum and say, oh, there's lots of different ways you can be a person. Some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are, that talk about kind of gender fluid. Some people are trans. And the doctor said this, but this is how they really are. Kids also are really open to that. It's kind of like the world is a confusing place to kids, and there's a lot of variation and stuff going on. So they kind of trust you when you explain something. So if you don't explain it, they'll pick the simplest, most rigid thing on their own because they're limited and that's what they do. But if you explain the variation, then that's the answer. And so that's where we get often kind of frustrated of, like preschool teachers and things like that saying, well, we don't want to have those kind of conversations. I was like, but you say there's the boys' restroom and there's the girls' restroom. You just talked about gender identity. Or when you say he's and she's, you just talked about gender identity. All you got to do is change the labeling. We're not talking about sexuality. I don't want to have a conversation about sexuality. That's just my own comfort zone. Gender identity is just your gender identity. Those are different things. And preschoolers totally understand that. And they understand that kids come from different families. So, those ideas about from birth, what do you talk about? Seeing books, like kids' books that show diverse people, like racially and ethnically diverse from different countries with gender diverse families. That's kids' world, to see diverse people, to see the different types of families we come in. And some families have two dads, and some families have two moms, and some families have a grandma and an aunt. I think that's how you show kids that there's a lot of variation, and that just then normalizes the spectrum of humanity for kids. And it doesn't become this big issue that you have to then sit down and talk to kids about.
Well, obviously you're speaking my language as a book seller, because that is our number one thing, especially during the pandemic. Because I think a lot of parents, one of your suggestions for parents is, obviously like socialize your children in many different ways with lots of different people. And, parents pre-pandemic could decide, well, I'm going to take my kids to a different playground. We're going to join this faith community instead of this faith community. You can do a lot of things just by moving your body to a different part of town, at least in Atlanta, but in a lot of places. And right now that's hard. So if you live in a segregated residential community, your school is segregated because it's based on where you live. You go to a segregated faith community, whatever that is, like all of that, those are your individual choices, but it's also structurally created in this country by design, right? The best way and the easiest way, frankly, to support your children in thinking about the world in different ways is to have different media, and particularly picture books. I mean, that's, that is so much of why Charis exists, is that we really are like, no, kids need to see themselves, if they need to see themselves reflected if they are not the majority or the dominant group, but also they need to see all of the beautiful variation of humanity. And so much, like, I mean, particularly one of the needs that we often think a lot about is like kids with incarcerated parents, kids who are being raised by their grandma, kids in foster care. That's another difference that is often not seen in mainstream media, or is portrayed as inherently negative. And it's like, there are lots of really beautiful kids books now, thank goodness, that are about like, isn't that special that you have a grandma who takes care of you, or whatever your family structure is. But children love that and are very receptive to it.
Yeah, it is. It's like, it really is, I think, hard to quantify how important it is. And it is. I know I'm, as we say in the South, preaching to the choir, to a bookstore, but I say that a lot. Is, for one, I think there are so many books out there that are good. And when you see the impact it makes on a kid, it is just a profound difference. And I think now, it was harder when I had, I have a 17-year-old. And so when they were younger, it was a little bit harder because 17 years ago, there were fewer of those out there. But I think like Everywhere Babies, that was one of my favorite picture books. And it very just subtly in there has these diverse families. There's like the 2-mom family, the 2-dad family. There's the grandparents. Like, it just is this shows the spectrum of humanity without it being about that. But I'm like, that kind of stuff for kids of color, for kids in those families, but also for white kids with white parents, to see that. And now there's so many. And I think, just an anecdote of it is, we had one book, Marissa McDonald Doesn't Match, I think is the name of the book. And she is Peruvian and Scottish, I think. So my middle schooler, so I'm having to go a little bit back in my head. But I was giving this book, I was cleaning out bookshelves and giving it to, kind of what we always do is you pass it to the next parent with the next younger kids in line. So I was giving it to a friend of mine who's Indian, so is Indian American with a white American husband. And so her kids are biracial. And so I just, without a whole lot of thinking, that was one of the books. She said that kid started, so her daughter was like 4 or 5, and she was crying when she was reading it, saying, this is like us, and carried the book around. She said she slept with the book, carried it around for like 2 weeks, like took it to preschool, carried it in her bag, like had it in her pillow, next to her pillow. I was like, you forget how profoundly moving those are for the kid that doesn't see that much.
Yeah.
And this is a kid with a ton of resources that lives in a diverse space. But it's like, those are I think the powerful stories that, and that's like, for the price of a book, or even just, going to the library, it is a really powerful way to give kids exposure when you don't have it in your day-to-day life. And I think even if you do have it in your day-to-day life. Yeah. And I think also, and I'll stop talking after this, but I also think it's really good discussion points for kids, because then you can sit, and for a parent that may feel uncomfortable having these conversations and like bringing these things up, you can sit and you can have a conversation. So like, we had a board book about Martin Luther King. So, it was a board book. So, they were little, but we would talk about segregation and structural forms of inequality, because you'd be like, well, what do you think about this? And so it's a way to have those conversation starters that feel a little bit more organic than just saying, let's sit down on the couch and talk about racism. It's much easier when you have the book and you can ask a question or two, and then you'll read it again the next week and you'll have another question or two, and it just becomes part of the dialogue.
That's one of the things, actually, that's a perfect segue, because that's where I wanted to go next. One of the things that we really try and help people get comfortable with is the idea that, like, you don't need to have the racism talk, like the birds and the bee. Like, hopefully people are also not only talking to their children about sex and body development one time, but some people still are. But, that all these things really need to be ongoing, much lower stakes conversations with your kids. Like, that this happens while you're eating Cheerios in the car. It happens, while you're watching the newest Marvel movie. It happens, in all these different parts of your life. And, to the people who are like, well, I have a 6-month-old, like, I'm not going to talk about race to my 6-month-old. I'm like, it's actually a really good time to start practicing, because, you can this helps you get over your anxiety. Just start babbling at your 6-month-old and, narrating books to them, explaining things to them. It actually really makes a difference. And then by the time they're 2 and can actually really process some of what you're saying, you will be a lot more fluid about it, a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, like there's because that's where I think books are helpful. Because, from when my kids were infants, I still do read to them at night. We'd sit and have a book like The Skin You're In, and be like, oh, look how pretty her skin is. Look, her. And so one of the things we know that how one way bias expresses itself is what they call kind of outgroup homogeneity effect, meaning we think everyone looks alike in a particular outgroup. We all do it. We think, why do they all look alike? Well, no, it's just because they're a different group than you. We all look the same amount of different and the same amount of the same. It's just we can't see the difference if we're not used to looking at individuality. And so one of the things that works is to point out differences to kids and really kind of train them to notice individual features and to think about how people look different from one another. And so when they are babies, you can look at books and say, oh, look at her curly hair, or look, she has, look at how her lips are really pink. Oh, look at how her skin is brown like chocolate. Hers is more like caramel. You can have those like really conversations that are positive and affirming and help, for one, see the beauty in people, of all people. And it helps you look at how people do differ as individuals, not clustered as just groups. And those are really easy conversations to have with a little baby, because you're already kind of pointing, oh, look at how dark brown her eyes are. Oh, look, her eyes have gold in them. Right.
Yeah. Well, you're already naming the world.
But those are early conversations about race. I mean, that's what that is. It's helping from the very beginning, but in a way that feels, I think it is. It's kind of like training wheels for us too.
Yeah. I mean, I think particularly white people who are socialized in the South, so often just have so much anxiety and trying to raise their kids differently than how they were raised. But sometimes they're fighting against their own parents who are still in their child's life, and they want to, they just very stuck, which I have a lot of empathy for. And I really, if folks can take any message from your book, it's like just start where you are, just start talking, and that children are both much smarter than we give them credit for and need much more structure and much more guidance, I think, than they often receive, because it sounds like they're filling in the gaps. It sounds like.
I think that's one of the biggest lessons, is that they are thinking about other people. But that's one of the things that's great about us as humans. We have this big old frontal lobe, and we want to think about other people. And they're thinking about how people go together or don't. And in the absence of parent information, they fill in the gaps. They're not immune to it. And they're filling in the gaps much, much earlier than parents think. And I think that, and it is better to stumble and to mess up sometimes, and even to come back to your kids and say, how we talked about that, I really kind of didn't do that great. I'm going to try it. Let's do that again. Because I think it's okay to also to model for kids. Sometimes we mess up too. Like, we're also trying to be better. And sometimes I have biases that come out and I don't mean for them to, and I have to correct myself. And so I think it's also a good parenting lesson of just saying, I kind of screwed that up. I'm going to do that differently. Because I think that helps kids learn that we're not built perfect at this stuff, that it's a lifelong learning, and that it's okay to admit when you mess up. And the goal is just to keep at it. I mean, that's really all we can hope for, is just that we every day try to get better. And we do that throughout our life.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because that's something I think also, if we're having more low stakes conversations, the stakes of messing up once are just so less dire than if this is my one shot and I've screwed it up, it really does make a difference. I think, we may have folks watching at home who are like, well, my kid's 16 and I haven't, we barely talked about any of this stuff, and now they're going to go away to college in a couple of years or move out of the house. If I want to do something differently now with my teenager, where do I begin?
And I think the conversations differ. I mean, I say this having, I have a 17-year-old, and I think, in the context of race, and it differs based on the race of your kid. Totally. I happen to have a white kid. And so our conversations are about white privilege. Those are not conversations I had when they were little. I think that is a more adolescent concept. But, I was writing this book. I started writing this book, 2017, something like that. And while I was writing it, COVID happened, and then George Floyd was murdered. And so the whole nation changed, kind of all of a sudden started paying attention to race in a way that they hadn't. But I'd been writing this book long before all of that started. So as I was writing it and having to kind of change and add information as it was happening in real time. I remember having conversations with my kid. So this is now in the book, but it literally was just happening, in real time of how do you think that would have happened? Like what can white people do in those situations where you're safe, but you can use your privilege to be helpful to someone that does not have that. And so kind of having conversations of, I don't worry about you being shot by police because they think that you're a criminal because you're a white girl. That's not my worry. And that is an injustice. I mean, I don't want to worry about it, but I don't want anyone else worrying about it either. And so what can you do in that situation? Like, can you pull your phone out and start videoing it? Who can you call to try to intervene? So having those conversations, which again, I wouldn't have had when they were 5, but at 17, we can have those conversations of how can you use the privileges you have. And she has other things that she has marginalized identities too. So she identifies as queer. And so she has lots of other things that I do worry about. But in terms of race, the conversation is more complicated. And it also is less comfortable because it's more scary and like real heavy. It's not just pointing out the beauty of skin tone. Now it's heavier, but also we can have more of a dialogue. And it's like, this is really terrible. What do we do? Like, what can you do if that happens? And help her come up with ideas. So I think that there's always things to talk about. It just differs based on how old the kid is and what the kid can handle. And kids have different personalities, but kids are noticing this stuff. And so I think that's the thing of just ask your kid, well, what do you think about this? What have you thought about it? What do you think is going on? I think starting with questions is also really helpful because that way you're not presuming anything. You're kind of seeing, well, what are you thinking about this? And I think that's always a good place to start too.
Yeah. Another sort of major concern that a lot of parents come to us with is they see the politicization and the sort of the recruitment, I guess, of particularly white boys, but all boys, teenage boys, and even tween boys on video game channels and YouTube stuff around misogyny and homophobia. And often that is sort of layered in with a white nationalist flavor. It's all very related. And they kind of, there is some interest in the brain science behind that, right? Like, is this, this sort of in-group, out-group kind of thing because kids feel the need to prove themselves at that age? Like, what's, there's just so many parents feel like failures because they'll be like, well, I looked at my son's phone and all of a sudden I realized like he's looking at terrible shit. Like, what do I do now? Right. And he's 13, right? Do you, is that a particular moment in time with kids that we need to be paying attention to, or,
I think middle school is a particularly important moment in time. And I'll say I've studied this for a long time. And now when I realize when my kids are in middle school, it becomes particularly horrifying because I know all the bad stuff that is going on. And so when it's your own kid there, you're like, oh God, this is just really rough. When hormones kick in and puberty kicks in, things become particularly problematic. I think particularly in the context of like sex, like pornography. So the age at which kids are looking at pornography is now around age 11 and 12. So I think we also as adults forget how much easy access kids have to hardcore things that we did not have access to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm in my mid 40s. So I think, when I was a kid, for people to look at stuff, you'd get somebody's like Playboy, or you'd have, Cinemax at night or something like that. But now we see kids that are looking at pornography on their phone in the middle of school. So we were doing a study and we walked up to a middle schooler who was literally looking at like Pornhub on his phone. And so I think it is a world that we have to come to terms with, and it is happening earlier because puberty is happening a little bit earlier, and because we have normalized sexualization so much. And kids see so much sexualization just in a normative way that pretty extreme forms of sexuality, and it is not women feeling agentic about their bodies. It is misogynistic, oppressive forms of sexuality. And so they're seeing it really young. And so it's like they both have the hormones that make them interested, the peer norms that support it. You have teachers terrified to talk about it because there is a complicated political culture around sexuality, for example. And kids don't have like the impulse control or the emotion regulation. They have the hormones, but not the rest of their brain hasn't developed yet. So they're not making good choices either. So they're interested, but they're not, like the gas pedal works, but the brakes don't work. Is often the analogy that's used. It's like the Ferrari engine, but the go-kart brakes is kind of what a middle schooler is like. And so then you add pornography, for example, that is often, and things that are like really homophobic, really misogynistic, violent. Often you have race lumped in there as well. And parents often just assume, oh, my kid's not doing that.
Do they have a phone?
Yeah. I mean, I just learned that you can get Pornhub on a Switch, like a Nintendo Switch.
Oh gosh, I didn't know that.
So like also the world changes so quickly that I think it is tough for parents. So I think parents have to talk about media literacy and at really young ages. So elementary school, but definitely by middle school, you have to just check in a lot. And it is uncomfortable. I find that's not my comfort zone. I talk about the other stuff all the time, but that's just not my comfort zone. But I have to just say, I got to put on my big kid pants and talk about it because they're seeing it. And the stats that show kids are looking at porn at 11 is, I think, a horrifying stat because I'm not, I don't think parents are prepared for that, but that is the world that kids live in. Yeah. And I think the way in which media is so private now, because kids can see it without, it's not the old days of you had the one TV in the house and it was on a television. Now you can see a lot without parents knowing. Yeah. And so parents have to figure out really strict parental controls and really just talking to kids a lot about it. There's all this research that shows kids want to talk to kids want parents' input on things, even on these kind of issues, but they do get embarrassed at the same time. So they want parents to weigh in, but they're not really going to be bringing it up. So it's up to us just to do it and say, I'm going to grit my teeth and have the conversation anyways. And I got to do it earlier than I think I should.
Yeah. I mean, we really are recommending 8-9 years old that people really start to have those conversations, because we just keep hearing like kids in the 3rd grade are bringing their phone to school and looking stuff up. And then the other kids are totally freaked out and, and yeah, it's awful.
Yeah.
I wanted to pivot a little bit to the perception. I think there's a perception that things are so much better for LGBTQ kids today, which I think is on the whole true. But I think that sometimes masks the amount of bias that is occurring in schools right now, and it's violence and emotional bias and bullying. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your research about queer and trans kids and kind of what they're experiencing right now and how we can support them.
Yeah, I find that to be another interesting issue, because I do think that on the one hand, and I kind of grappled with this when I was writing it. It's like on the one hand, you see a lot more LGBTQ representation in media, right? So there's a lot more visibility. But what we don't realize is that's really in like adult media. It's not in what kids are seeing necessarily. So there's a real invisibility in terms of what kids are seeing, in terms of representation. It's very rarely in children's media. So there's both invisibility that's directed at kids. And at the same time, it is gay as a slur. I think it's something like, off the top of my head, it's like 97% of middle schoolers have used gay as a slur on a regular basis. I mean, it's just ubiquitous. They just say it constantly. We were in a school doing data collection, and my graduate student, who was like a 28-year-old man, was in the bathroom, and a kid came in and called him a gay slur. Like a kid called a grown man a slur in the bathroom. I mean, it is so pervasive. And so it's really common in middle school. It continues into adolescence. And we know it happens. This is one of those issues where I think for boys, they have it a little bit worse. So I think there's a lot of oppression that girls face: sexualization, sexual harassment, STEM bias, all sorts of things. But when it comes to kind of homophobic bias and like sexual prejudice, I think boys face really violent, extreme forms of bias early. And even kids who would identify as straight that show any mild form of being not hyper masculine. So, boys that like to read, boys that like poetry, we get lots of reports of teasing and bullying for them. And we see that it really affects them too. I think that's what's always so disturbing too. So teasing, harassment, rejection, really common. And it's associated with things like depression and anxiety, eating disorders. The rates of suicide are really high. The rates of, attempted suicides are really high, wanting to miss school. The effects of it are really profound for those boys. The effects of it are actually worse for the boys than for the girls, partly just because I think what it means to be a man in this country is really, really narrow. Mm-hmm. And kids work really hard to police the boundaries on that. Girls have a little bit more flexibility. I think there's more acceptance of like lesbian and bisexual girls than there is for like gay men, for example. And there's lots of theories about why, but for boys, I think it is a really pervasive part. And I think that, it gets chalked up as like locker room talk, or that's boys being boys. But like the rates of like the stats of like suicide rates for like trans youth is horrifically high. And I think we can no longer just say that's just like boys being boys or kids being kids. Like the bullying that goes on now. And even though it's, outlawed by, it's banned by schools, often teachers just ignore it. Because they say, oh, that's just kids being kids. It's like, yeah, but the kids gotta, plan to take their life and they're 14. We have to rethink how we're doing this. Yeah. I just think the cost of it is just too profound. But it's completely pervasive. So I think whether it's the very subtle or not subtle, but seemingly benign, using gay to mean stupid, which is what kids think, to the, physical assault, I think all of it does damage. I think when you normalize using gay as stupid, when you're a gay kid, that's problematic. I mean, yeah. Right? And all kids are hearing it. And I think that's just simply got to change. Like we have to put our foot down and say, we can no longer accept that as normal. And teachers have to start enforcing it. They don't now, but they have to start enforcing that is not allowed.
One of the things that we're seeing is this strange, this mismatch between this idea that somehow queer people and feminists and woke anti-racist won the culture war, and therefore somehow we're forcing our norms on the normal quote unquote Bible believing straight Christians of America, and
like how there are two different categories. Yeah.
Right. And therefore all of these namby-pamby policies should not have to be enforced by Christian teachers who don't, that those kids brought it on themselves, basically. Right. If you're going to be a weirdo that doesn't wear clothes appropriate to your gender, I can't really help you if you get teased. You're courting this, basically, is often the attitude, even from teachers who get accommodations. And, it's really, and I think there's a lot of, one of the things that the Christian fundamentalist right has done a really good job of is create a victim complex and right. a group identity. And so it's this idea of, well, like, these people are winning, they're taking over our country, and we are the ones who are actually victims. So if they force their values into your classroom and then people push back, that's like a healthy, that's just two opposing ideologies duking it out. And isn't that what makes America great? Right. But that's like 11-year-olds.
Yeah. And that's why I'm always like thankful that I'm a developmental psychologist. I was like, I'm not trying to justify how you treat 40-year-olds. I could, and I think it's morally abhorrent how some people treat 40-year-olds, but I'm not. I'm like, I'm talking about a kid. I've had people, when we published a study on sexual harassment, and it got some press, and this was years ago. And somebody was saying, and it was like, it was basically sexual assault in like gyms and band rooms and things like that in middle school. And I remember somebody commenting on the internet, this was pre-Twitter, not pre-Facebook, but pre-Twitter, but somebody commenting on, well, she's asking for it if she's wearing a skirt or like makeup. And I'm like, she's 14. I don't know how to, and I struggle with this, especially, you see this with trans kind of youth and trans kids. And it's like, I am struggling to come up with an argument that makes people feel compassion towards a child.
Right.
I'm like, I don't know what I can do to make you feel compassionate to a child who research shows if they face this, there's a 50% attempt suicide. You want them to die for this? Like, that's what I don't know how to make you care about that. If your humanity doesn't speak to that, it's hard for me to know where to go with that. Like, I wish I had this like great answer, so we say, well, I don't know. It's we're talking kids, and maybe the kid is, maybe you're right. Maybe the kid's being weird, and maybe the kid will grow out of it. And maybe it's this kid, but there's a lot of kids that do really weird stuff. These are weird. My husband would, we had a kid that went to our child's very progressive preschool that would always wear a Davy Crockett, like coonskin hat to school. Well, that's weird too. But but no one thinks that this kid shouldn't be allowed to go to school and wants to mandate which bathroom this kid can use because he wears a coonskin cap. But that's weird. So I think even if that's your argument,
right?
Do we want the kid to have bladder infections, to have hospitalizations because of UTIs? And that's what we know trans kids are going through, right? Like, is that really the price because you think this kid's doing something different than you want? I would make an argument this kid is just trying to be themselves and trying to be themselves the best way they know how. And why is it your job to make their life more difficult? Yeah. If you just wrap them in compassion and support, what's the cost to you? That doesn't take away your rights. But I don't know. I struggle with that. Of like, I don't know how to make you feel compassion to a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
I guess I need to, as a job, I need to figure out that argument better, but that's a tough one.
No, it is a tough one. And I think it does bring up, again, that's why I focus so much of my energy on working with parents who are interested in doing this work and just don't have the tools, because I do think that's where you can actually create change. And I think, your book, as we're getting towards the end of our conversation, your book does offer a lot of concrete ideas. So sometimes these books offer a lot of good analysis about the situation, but not so many tools. But you offer a lot of tools, and so I wonder, and as you mentioned, they are sort of divided between the home, the school, and then the more global, political world. Is there something, if somebody just had to start somewhere, what do you think is like the easiest place for families to kind of begin to start unraveling bias in their world?
I think part is just having conversations. I think making these not taboo topics, I think, it depends a little bit on the kid's age, but I think giving kids a schema, like a kind of a structure for understanding all these forms of biases, and maybe pick the one that's most impactful to your family, right? So I think that's kind of one thing I try to say is pick the one that feels most urgent for you. And talk about the biases we have, help kids spot it in the world. I think that's a big part of it. So that when you see it, when you recognize it, when you see it. Helping kids know, how do I respond when I see it? So how can I stop it if I see someone else saying something? How can I be what we call kind of an upstander? So I'm not just being passive, but how can I, okay, so let me spot it and recognize it. And let me feel like a sense of urgency to stop it. Because I think all kids, I think we teach compassion to our kids, and we teach kindness and empathy. Like those are, I think, are pretty universal parents try to talk to, like be kind to other people. So I think we just build on that and factor in these other group level inequalities, then we can build on this message of kindness and empathy and think, well, how can I turn that really important human kind of quality to fixing some of these other social things? So I think that's an easy one. I think also just diversify your world in all ways. So whether it be racial or gender, whether it be, kind of sexual orientation, just help kids get comfortable with diversity. And that can go lots of, whether it be picture books that are diverse, whether it be going to the Pride Festival downtown with a teenager, right? Like there's lots of ways in which you can help kids see diversity, whether it be going to museums. I think helping, because I think the more comfortable we are with people different than us, that's one of the most effective ways to reduce bias. What we call kind of intergroup contact is when you see other people's humanity, it gets easier. So I think those are easy places to start. And then pay attention for who you're voting for. I learned that a lot. I mean, I actually learned a lot writing this book, how much things like the local school board matter. And so like, just get engaged, like pay attention to, often the presidents get a lot of the kind of headlines, but local politics is really important. Look at, things like how the police get funded in your local town. Vote for the mayor that you think would do it better. Like just get engaged at that level too, because those folks have a lot of power over our kids' lives in ways that I think are a little horrifying when you think about how much we're often not engaged. School boards, for example, have a lot of say.
They ban a lot of books, a lot of queer books, a lot of books.
They ban a lot of queer books.
Yeah.
And so it was, that was, I was writing this book, I was writing a lot about kind of Gavin Grimm and one of those, the trans kid that's been really kind of fighting. And there was these videos where they filmed him at the school board meeting. And he was just kind of crying and saying, I just want to be a normal kid. He's like, I'm just a boy and I just want to like go to school and have a normal day. And he's talking to the school board. I was like, they had so much power in that situation. But instead it got dragged out for years. And it's like that kind of stuff, like we should, as community members, we should pay more attention. So that's the other one. That's like, it's one of those things you don't think about. I mean, I didn't really think much about it, but being mindful that those people have power and we should be mindful of who we put in power.
And run if there's no good options. Cause I think often what happens is they're all, usually they're all not aligned, with my values. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do because I don't like any of these people, but
yeah.
People got to
find people that are good and encourage them to do it. Like there are ways to realize that stuff does affect our lives. And that back to the question of, now we're almost out of time, but back to the question of like, when the teachers aren't in favor of it and there's all that division, well, that's the benefit of having laws that are fair, because even if the teacher disagrees, if the law is on your side, then they have to do it. And so that's why those things do matter, is because it takes human opinion out of it. And so we got to make sure those structures are in place too.
Yeah. And that's so key because, particularly in the South, it's like people really just bring so much religion into classrooms and into places where, and it's not, and well, I don't need to get on my soapbox, but it's often not even real religion. It's just bias cloaked in false religion. So, I think that's so helpful. All of those tools, I think, give folks places to start. But this book is so accessible. I think, people, parents, teachers, but really anybody who is interested in how our brains work, how we came to acquire the biases that we all have, I think will really get a lot out of this. And so very grateful to you for this book as well as for your first book. So if folks would like to buy it from Charis, it really does help us when folks buy the book from us. You can click this teal link at the bottom center of the screen to one click buy it from Charis. I'll also be adding captions to this and putting it up on our YouTube channel in a couple days. So that will go out again. And where can folks find your work? Do you do social media? Do you want to shout out anything that you're working on, Dr. Brown?
So yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. So I do that. So at Christia Brown. And then Instagram, I'm trying to be a little bit better with Instagram, but Twitter, I do a lot. And then when I, tweet stuff, then you get the people with strong opinions that go back. So it's always nice to see supportive people on social media.
Yes. Good. Go follow. And, well, we hope maybe in the future we'll get to host you in person at the store, but this has been lovely. So thank you so much for all your work. It really is a gift to many, many people.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,